In a crowded courtroom that air thick with anticipation, Angela stood tall before the judge. She had never imagined finding herself in this position. A minor violation was all it took, yet she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, as though the eyes of everyone in the room were scrutinizing her every move. Judge Harris, a man known for his strict and unyielding nature, gazed down at her from his elevated bench. His face was a mask of neutrality, but Angela could feel an unspoken tension between them. It was subtle but undeniable. She knew he saw her as just another offender, a face among many in the system, yet for her this moment was anything but ordinary. She wasn't just any person in this courtroom. She was someone with a story, someone who had worked tirelessly to make a difference in her community, but in the judge's eyes, she was nothing more than another name on a docket, another case to be closed. Angela could sense his judgment before the words even left his mouth. His demeanor wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. The way he spoke to her lacked any empathy. It was clinical, impersonal. He issued the fine without hesitation, as if it were a mere formality, and Angela felt the sting of his words more than the fine itself. It wasn't about the money, it was about how he saw her, how he reduced her to a statistic, a number in a system designed to forget the complexities of those it impacted. She took a deep breath before speaking, quietly acknowledging the fine. But something inside her stirred. She refused to let the moment pass without a trace of her own power. She stood there not as a victim but as a woman who knew her worth, even if the judge couldn't see it. She left the courtroom with her head held high, but the feeling of injustice lingered. It was more than just the fine, it was the way she had been treated in that space. A space where authority reigned without question. She couldn't shake the thought of how often people like her were overlooked or dismissed entirely by those who wielded power, without understanding the full picture. As she walked out the doors of the courthouse and into the crisp air of the street, she made a quiet vow to herself that this wouldn't be the end of it. Somehow, some way, she would make her voice heard, even if it had to start in the quiet spaces where people weren't looking. She sat in her car, reflecting on the moment she had just experienced. Her fingers hovered over the steering wheel as she thought about the judge and the fine, how his actions had impacted her, but also how they had lit a fire in her. She had always believed in justice, but she had never felt so distant from it as she did in that courtroom. It was a harsh reminder of how easily people could be judged without ever being truly seen, and she couldn't let that stand. It was in that moment that Angela made a decision, a small yet powerful one. She would follow the judge on social media. It seemed like a simple act, but to her it was a form of quiet rebellion, an opportunity to make a connection, to challenge his understanding, to show him that there was more to her than what he had seen in the courtroom. Maybe, just maybe, she could get him to see beyond the surface. Angela sat in her car for a moment, her fingers still resting on the steering wheel, as the reality of what had just happened settled over her. She had been in that courtroom before many times, but never had she felt so invisible, never had she been so reduced to a mere statistic, to an offender, someone who didn't deserve the chance to explain or be understood. And as the door slammed shut behind her, she felt something stir inside her, an urge to do something, anything to shift the balance, to make the judge see her as more than a case number. And so, in the silence of her car, she grabbed her phone and opened the social media app. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she searched for the name she knew so well, Judge Harris. It didn't take long to find his public profile, filled with posts about his work in the courtroom and his opinions on various legal matters. Angela took a deep breath and clicked the follow button. It was a small action, a quiet decision, but in that moment it felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and maybe, just maybe, the judge would see her name in his notifications and wonder who she was. She didn't expect anything in return, but she did expect him to know her name, to see her, and for once in her life to not be invisible. As she sat back in her seat, she let out a long breath. She wasn't sure why following him felt so important, but it was more than just the desire for recognition. It was a desire to be heard, a desire for something deeper than what had transpired in the courtroom. It was a statement that she wasn't just going to let this pass without making a mark. Angela thought about the judge and the way he had looked at her in the courtroom. the way he had issued the fine without hesitation, she had wondered for a moment if he even saw her as human, or if she was simply another person to be processed through the system. It wasn't just the fine that hurt, it was the lack of connection, the lack of understanding, the feeling that she was just another face in the crowd. So now she would force his hand a little, she would make him see her name, and maybe that would make a difference. Angela didn't know where this would lead, but she couldn't shake the thought of how often people like her were overlooked and erased. She wasn't willing to let that happen, not again, not to her, not when she had so much more to offer than the judge had allowed himself to see. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was prepared to make herself known whether the judge liked it or not. So she sat back and let the silence linger around her for a few moments, wondering if the action she had just taken would lead to anything or if it would simply disappear into the digital ether. But in her heart, Angela knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. In the days that followed, Angela didn't expect much from her decision to follow Judge Harris on social media, but she found herself checking his profile more than once, her curiosity growing as she scrolled through his posts and updates. Most of them were about legal matters and his thoughts on justice reform, but there was an undertone in his words that intrigued her. His posts often sounded certain, almost rigid, as if his views were the only correct ones, but she didn't mind it because she saw an opportunity to change his mind. She began to engage with his posts, leaving thoughtful comments, asking questions about his views on justice and fairness, especially when it came to the ways in which the system treated people like her, people of color, people who were often judged by their skin before their actions. Her comments were never hostile, but they were direct and respectful. She wanted him to see a different perspective, a perspective he hadn't considered yet. Angela's words were calculated. She didn't want to come across as just another person trying to argue with him. She wanted him to understand her point of view and perhaps for the first time question his own assumptions. It wasn't long before Judge Harris started to notice her comments. She had made it clear that she wasn't just another follower interested in his legal opinions. Her comments were thoughtful, engaging, and sometimes even challenging in a way that made him pause for a second or two longer than he was used to. The first few times he saw her name pop up on his posts, he thought little of it, but soon he realized her comments were more than just casual thoughts. They were insightful questions that made him think deeper than he was accustomed to thinking. He was used to having people agree with him, but Angela's comments weren't about agreeing, they were about questioning him in a way that felt personal without being aggressive, and Judge Harris couldn't help but be drawn into it. He started reading her comments more carefully, and as the days passed, he found himself responding to her with a little more thoughtfulness than he had to others. His posts about the legal system now seemed to invite her critique, and she didn't hesitate to share her thoughts on how the system was flawed and how important it was for those in power to understand the lived experiences of marginalized communities. Angela's commentary wasn't just about pointing out flaws, it was about offering solutions, ideas that came from years of experience working within the community. She had seen the struggles firsthand and was determined to make a difference, even if it meant challenging someone like Judge Harris, who represented the very system she aimed to reform. One day, after a particularly heated exchange where Angela had asked him about the racial disparities in sentencing, Judge Harris found himself thinking about her words long after he logged off his computer. He couldn't shake the idea that maybe he hadn't fully understood the weight of the decisions he made in his courtroom. Maybe he hadn't considered how those decisions affected people like Angela and others who faced the same systemic challenges. He had spent his career administering the law, but had he ever truly understood how the law affected those who didn't have the privilege? He had spent years in a position of power, but what did that really mean when people like Angela felt invisible in the very system he upheld? As the weeks passed, Judge Harris found himself thinking more and more about Angela's comments and the conversations they had sparked in his mind. It was strange to him how one person could challenge his long-held beliefs so effectively with just a few words, but Angela had done just that with every comment she left, with every post she engaged in. He began to feel something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of unease, not the unease of a guilty conscience, but the feeling of being confronted by something he couldn't easily dismiss, something that forced him to reconsider his own views on justice, the law, and the people who were impacted by it. Judge Harris had always prided himself on his fairness and impartiality, But as he reflected on his past rulings, he started to question whether he had ever truly been fair, or if he had simply relied on the systems he had always known without ever questioning them, without ever seeing the people he had impacted for who they really were. And as he spent more time on social media responding to Angela's posts and reading her critiques, he began to notice something else, something he couldn't ignore. The way she spoke about justice was different. It wasn't just about laws and rules, it was about people, it was about empathy and understanding, it was about recognizing the inherent worth of every individual and seeing them beyond the labels and categories society often placed on them. Angela's words echoed in his mind long after their conversations ended, but it wasn't just her words that had an impact, it was the way she made him feel, as though his role as a judge was more than just about applying the law, it was about understanding the consequences of those applications, about recognizing that the law didn't exist in a vacuum, it existed in a world where people struggled, fought, and sometimes suffered, and that suffering often wasn't visible in the sterile walls of his courtroom. Judge Harris was no stranger to the complexities of his work, but Angela's questions had peeled back a layer of understanding he hadn't considered before, and he realized that in his years of administering justice, he had failed to see the full picture. He had failed to see the people behind the cases. He had dismissed the pain behind the rules he had enforced. The power he held had never felt as heavy as it did now, and it weighed on him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just a matter of legal precedent or rulings, it was about the human cost of the decisions he made and how often he had overlooked the stories of the people who came before him. Angela had opened his eyes to something he had never truly understood before, and it was something he couldn't easily forget. And so as he scrolled through his notifications one evening and saw another comment from Angela, something shifted within him. He had to know more. He couldn't just keep responding to her posts without fully understanding who she was, what motivated her, what drove her to speak so passionately about these issues. And so he decided to send her a private message. It wasn't an apology or a plea for forgiveness, it was simply a question. He wanted to ask her more about her views on justice, her experiences with the legal system, and how he could do better. It wasn't much, but it was a step forward, and Judge Harris knew he had to take it if he was ever going to truly understand the issues he had spent years judging from a distance. Judge Harris stared at the screen of his phone, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He knew he had to send the message, but the words didn't come easily. It felt strange to reach out to someone like Angela, someone he had once seen as just another case, but now she was something more to him. She was the catalyst that had forced him to confront his own biases and limitations as a judge. He had spent so many years in his position of authority, but never had he been forced to reckon with the deeper implications of his actions until now. His mind raced as he considered how to phrase his message. What did he want from her exactly? It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a confession of guilt, it was something more. It was an invitation to connect on a deeper level, to understand the person behind the critiques, to hear her story in a way that went beyond the digital comments and posts he had been reading. He wanted to listen, he wanted to learn. He had spent too many years in a system that encouraged him to judge and decide without ever fully understanding the lives of the people he impacted, and Angela had shown him just how much he had been missing. So finally, with a deep breath, he began to type his message. "Hello Angela," he wrote, "I've been following your posts for some time now and I've been struck by your perspective on justice." He paused for a moment, unsure how to proceed, but then continued, "I've spent my career as a judge and I've always prided myself on being fair. But after reading your comments, I've come to realize there's a lot I've never considered." His fingers hovered over the screen as he tried to find the right words to express the depth of his feelings. "I would really appreciate the chance to learn more about your views on the system and your experiences." He paused again, trying to gather his thoughts, and finally wrote, "If you're open to it, I'd like to have a conversation with you. I believe I have a lot to learn, and I hope we can find a way to talk about how we can make the system better." He read over the message one more time and then hit send. It was a simple message, but it felt like a leap for him. It wasn't just about acknowledging his mistakes, it was about stepping outside the comfort zone of his position as a judge and opening himself up to the possibility of change. As the minutes passed, he felt a growing sense of anticipation, but also a twinge of anxiety. Would she respond? Would she even want to engage with him after everything that had happened? The way he had treated her in court, he wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew he had to try. He couldn't continue down the same path without challenging his own assumptions, without allowing himself to grow. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but then the notification appeared on his phone. Angela had responded. He opened the message quickly, his heart pounding with both hope and apprehension. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge Harris," the message began, "and I'm willing to talk if it means that we can make real change. But just so you know, it's not going to be easy." Judge Harris smiled to himself. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but the fact that she was willing to engage was a small victory in itself. The next day, Angela felt a mixture of anticipation and caution as she waited for a reply from Judge Harris. She had been thinking about his message all night, and despite her resolve, she couldn't help but wonder what he really wanted. Was he truly interested in hearing her thoughts, or was he just trying to smooth things over after the fine part of her wanted to be open to the possibility that he could change, but another part of her remained skeptical. She had seen too many people in positions of power brush aside the concerns of those who challenged them. Angela had spent years fighting against a system that too often treated people like her as less than or invisible. She wasn't sure if she could trust someone like him, but she had come this far. She couldn't back down now. She checked her phone again and saw the familiar notification. His message was waiting for her. She clicked on it and read his words carefully. "Thank you for your response, Angela." That he had written. "I understand that this conversation won't be easy, and I'm prepared for it." He continued, "I've spent a long time working in the system, but I've realized that I may have missed some important perspectives, and I want to learn more." Angela felt a knot form in her stomach. Reading his words, he was being honest, but did that mean he truly understood the impact of what he had done? How could he understand the weight of his decisions when he had never been on the other side? How could he truly grasp the struggles of people who were treated unfairly by the law? But at the same time, his willingness to acknowledge his limitations made her pause. She didn't know if it was enough, but it was something more than she had expected from him. She took a deep breath and began typing her response. "I'm willing to talk, but I need you to understand something first," she wrote. "This isn't just about one fine or one case. It's about a system that systematically disadvantages people like me." She paused again, her fingers hovering over the screen. "You may never fully understand what it's like to walk into a courtroom and know that the deck is stacked against you, but that doesn't mean we can't work towards making things better." She added after a moment, "I'm open to a real conversation, Judge Harris, but it needs to be about more than just your views on the law. It needs to be about understanding the human cost of the decisions we make every day in these systems." She pressed send and leaned back in her chair. Her heart was pounding. She didn't know if he would take her words seriously or if he would get defensive. But she knew she had to say it. She wasn't going to hold back anymore. If this conversation was going to go anywhere, it had to be honest. It had to be raw. She couldn't afford to let him think that everything was fine just because he had acknowledged his mistakes. In passing, this was about real change, and if he was truly open to it, he needed to prove it. She thought back to the day in court, when she had stood before him, when she had felt invisible, when she had felt judged before she even spoke. And she realized that this conversation was bigger than her. It was bigger than him. It was about dismantling the structures that allowed that kind of judgment to happen. It was about making sure no one ever had to experience what she had felt again. Angela waited for Judge Harris' response, and for a long moment it felt like nothing was going to happen. Her fingers twitched nervously as she kept checking her phone. But there was no reply. The silence between them grew heavier with every passing hour. She tried to distract herself by working on her cases at the office, but the thoughts of the conversation she had just initiated kept creeping into her mind. She couldn't help but wonder if she had gone too far, if she had said too much, if she was pushing him too hard to change too quickly. Maybe it was unrealistic to expect someone in his position to suddenly become enlightened and make drastic changes in the system that he had helped uphold for so long. But then she reminded herself why she was doing this. She had spent her entire life advocating for the people who didn't have a voice, for those who were oppressed and unheard. If she backed down now, if she allowed the system to continue as it was, she would be no better than the people who remained silent when others were suffering. So she sat up straighter, her mind made up, no more second guessing, no more doubts. Angela had a responsibility to keep pushing for change, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. She glanced at her phone again and saw a new message from Judge Harris. His name on the screen made her heart skip a beat. She opened it quickly. "Thank you for your honesty, Angela," he had written. "I want to be clear that I'm not asking for your forgiveness for the fine or anything else. I don't expect that to be something you can give me easily," the message continued. "But I am asking you for the chance to really understand your perspective and the experiences of people like you." She paused for a moment, reading his words. She had expected some form of defensiveness, but what she saw was genuine willingness to listen. His words felt less like an apology and more like an invitation, a challenge for them both to dig deeper into the issue at hand. He wasn't asking her to forgive, he was asking her to teach, and for the first time since their initial encounter in the courtroom, she felt as though he was really seeing her. She could sense his vulnerability in the message, and it surprised her because she had expected the same old dismissive tone she had heard from other people in positions of power over the years, but instead he was speaking to her as an equal, as a person with something valuable to offer. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," the message concluded, "but I am asking for the opportunity to learn and grow from this conversation. If you're willing." Angela let out a breath. She didn't know she had been holding. His words were carefully chosen, but there was something in them that made her feel hurt. She could tell he wasn't taking the conversation lightly, and that was a start. It wasn't everything, it wasn't a promise that the system would change overnight, but it was the beginning of something real, something that could make a difference. She stared at the screen for a few more moments before typing her response. "I appreciate your openness, Judge Harris," she wrote, "and I'm willing to have this conversation with you if you're committed to truly understanding and learning." She pressed send and set the phone down. Her heart was still racing, but now it felt different. She didn't know where this conversation would take them, but she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't going to be easy, but it had the potential to change everything. The days that followed felt like a blur to Angela. She spent hours reflecting on her conversation with Judge Harris and wondering where it might lead. Her mind was flooded with both excitement and uncertainty. She had agreed to open up to him, and she knew that this moment could change everything, but she also understood that change wasn't immediate. It took time, patience, and real effort on both sides. They had already begun to unpack a difficult conversation, but there was so much more to explore, so much more to address. She wasn't sure if he fully understood the gravity of the conversation they were having, or if he was just curious, but she hoped he was truly willing to learn and not just placate her. But she also knew this was bigger than just her or him. This was about every person who had ever felt unjustly treated by the system, every person who had been sentenced or judged before they even stepped into a courtroom, every person who had been labeled and discarded because of their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. This was about creating a shift in a system that had been broken for generations, and Angela wasn't going to back down now. Her phone buzzed again, and she saw another message from Judge Harris. She opened it quickly. "I've been thinking about what you said, Angela," the message began, "and I've realized that I've been blind to so many things I took for granted: my position, my privilege, and the way the system works." He continued, "I want to learn from you, but I also want to help in whatever way I can to bring about change." She paused as she read his words. Part of her felt relieved that he was finally recognizing the issues and the reality of his role in perpetuating them. But another part of her remained cautious. She had heard promises like this before from people who had meant well, but ultimately hadn't followed through. She wanted to believe him, but she couldn't afford to lower her guard just yet. "I'm glad you're reflecting on this," Angela typed in response, "but reflection isn't enough. Action is needed. We can talk all day, but if we don't push for real change, nothing will change." She hit send and waited for his reply. She didn't know what kind of actions he was ready to take, But she hoped it wasn't just words, they had to make a difference in tangible ways. The next week, they arranged to meet in person. Judge Harris suggested a neutral location somewhere public and quiet so they could have an open conversation. Angela agreed, but part of her felt apprehensive. She didn't know what to expect. She had been preparing herself for a difficult conversation, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for the full weight of what they would discuss. But she knew it was necessary, it had to happen if they were going to move forward, if they were going to break through the barriers that had divided them for so long. She arrived at the cafe early and sat at a table near the window watching the people pass by with a sense of anticipation in her chest. She knew this conversation would be different from any other she had ever had. She had the chance to challenge a powerful figure directly and make him see the real implications of his actions and the systems he upheld. She didn't know if he was truly ready for it, but she was willing to take the risk. They both had a lot to learn, and this conversation would be their first step toward finding common ground or facing the reality of how deep the divide really was. When Judge Harris arrived, he was already holding a cup of coffee and looked slightly nervous but determined. He sat down across from Angela and greeted her with a calm but genuine smile. He didn't waste any time. "I'm ready to listen," he said.